Magnus leaves his bishop on b7 completely hanging? What is he doing? Welcome back to Chess Dog. I'm John. Today we have a game between Hans Niemann and Magnus Carlsen, our current world champion. This was played at the FTX Crypto Cup. This is a rapid game, 15 minutes for each side with a 10-second increment. Hans Niemann has white, Magnus has black. Let's jump right in. Hans Niemann begins with e4. Magnus plays g6. d4, bishop to g7, the modern defense. Knight f3, d6, and bishop to e2. A very positional approach. It looks like Hans Niemann wants to play in the style of Magnus. He's not trying to win out of the opening, just get a playable position. Knight f6 hitting e4, knight c3, castles, castles, and e6. c6 is probably the most common idea here, but e6 is like the 7th most common move in my database. It's just a flexible move that maybe he'll advance one of these central pawns later in the game. h3 controlling g4, b6. He's got to find a place for that bishop on c8, so he decides to find Kedowit on b7 and hit that weak pawn on e4, a vulnerable pawn. e5 was played. So Hans Niemann decides to just go ahead and gain central space. The only downside is he allows the exchange of queens. After pawn takes pawn, he could have taken with the knight, but after bishop b7, bishop f3, he does have a slight advantage here. But only a very slight advantage with more space with the d4 pawn. Instead, he takes with the pawn, allowing the queens to be exchanged, and now knight f to d7, and it looks like black has a lot of uncomfortable pressure on the e5 pawn. White looks like he'll have to play bishop to f4. And white's okay here, but Hans Niemann does not do that. He plays a much more aggressive option. He goes in with knight to b5. Says, I'm going to put as much pressure on your queen side as I can. He goes right after the c7 pawn, threatening to take it and then capture that trapped rook on a8. So what is Magnus going to do? Well, he plays bishop to a6, but he missed a decent opportunity. He could have played this incredible move, a6. Now, why can't white just take on c7? That's right, because if he does grab on c7, then rook to a7. And the knight is completely trapped. So the knight would actually be forced back to c3, and the pressure on the queen side would decrease significantly. But Magnus plays bishop to a6. That sort of pins the knight to the bishop on e2. Bishop to f4 to protect the pawn. What if he just goes in and plays knight to c7? I mean, he is, after all, attacking the rook on a8. Well, after this sequence of moves, bishop takes bishop, rook e1, bishop takes knight, knight e5, threatening the fork on f3, and after king g2 to stop that, knight b c6, knight takes rook, rook takes knight. This is an almost forced sequence, and black has two knights for the rook and a much better position. Black is actually just winning here. His pieces are just far too strong, his pawn structure too healthy, so he's much better. So Hans Niemann plays bishop to f4, now rook to c8. He's got to defend that c7 pawn now, and Hans Niemann goes a4. Locking in that knight and saying, I'm not backing off from the queen side. I'm going to keep piling on the pressure. So Magnus plays the bishop back to b7. Now he's threatening a6 to kick the knight out. So what does Hans Niemann play? a5. A very strong idea. He's extending the mobility of this rook at a1, and he's also gaining space on the queen side. And he's saying, I'm not going to back down here. a6 was played. And so here, knight to c3 is okay. It's an equal position. But Hans Niemann says, I didn't come this far just to play an equal position. So he plays, boom, a takes b6, complicating the play and giving up a piece for a pawn, at least for a knight, excuse me, at least in the short term. So a takes b5. He takes the knight, and now rook to a7. So he's attacking the bishop on b7. So let's look at what could happen here. Let's say Carlsen takes the rook at a7. Then if pawn takes rook, he's hitting this knight on b8. So when that knight moves, rook takes d7. And after the pawn on a7 is recovered, you have basically an equal position. But up next is our power move of the game. Magnus plays knight takes b6. Magnus leaves his bishop on b7 completely hanging? What is he doing? Well, Hans Niemann says, I'm going to take that bishop, and he does. And here we see Magnus's idea. Knight to c6, and now this rook really has nowhere to go. He's threatening knight to a5, trapping that rook, and there's really nothing that white can do about it. So pawn take, get the material you can. Bishop takes the pawn on b5, knight to a5, hitting the rook. The rook goes ahead and takes the knight on b6. Pawn takes, knight to d4. So here, Magnus has won an exchange. He's won a rook, but white has a bishop and a pawn in exchange. He also has the advantage of the two bishops. The problem is this bishop over here on f4 is sort of biting on granite. This e5 pawn is in the way, and black's minor pieces, even though it's a bishop and knight, are really well placed. This dark squared bishop has a lot of potential here. Knight to c4, hitting the b2 pawn. Now, knight to c6, advancing that knight, and we have our fork alert of the game. Do you see the fork that Hans Niemann is threatening? That's right, he is threatening to pop right in to e7, forking the king and the rook. Magnus, aware of this, plays the bishop to f8 to cover the e7 square. He could retake the knight, and then after rook c6, bishop to d3. Black is still a little bit better with the extra material, but instead, Hans Niemann decides to play b3 to push that knight away, and now Magnus plays knight to a3. The knight hits the bishop at b5, which protects the knight at c6, and he also hits the pawn at c2. So basically, Hans Niemann has to play the following move. He plays c4, keeping this sort of structure intact for the time being. And now Magnus plays knight takes b5. He could play knight c2, offering the exchange of rooks later. And after, say, rook to d7, knight a1, hitting the b3 pawn, this would have been a good way for black to continue. But instead, he goes ahead and takes the bishop at b5. Pawn takes knight. Now, look at this knight on c6. That's a beautifully placed knight, secured by a pawn at b5 that is very hard to get rid of. So it's a really well-placed knight. But Nimzo knows one of the rules of chess is that it doesn't matter if a knight is beautifully placed. All that matters is it where the action is, or is the knight just all by itself? So we're going to see if this beautifully placed knight is a good knight or an irrelevant knight. Rook to a3 was played by Magnus, attacking the pawn at b3. Rook to d3 defends that pawn. Bishop to c5. Now Magnus is taking aim at this f2 pawn with the bishop well placed on c5. The bishop goes to g5. G4, with the idea of playing king to g2 and bishop to g3, would have been a good idea here for white, I think. Bishop to g5, and now rook c to a8, doubling rooks on the a file. And now g4. But in this position, this is less effective because black's rooks are now doubled and ready to pounce on white's position. So this is a little too late. He lost a tempo with this bishop going to g5. Rook to a2, immediately taking aim at the f2 pawn. Rook to f3. The rook is passively placed here. A better move would have been bishop to d2 to sort of block the range of motion of this rook at a2, denying it access to f2. If he plays bishop to h4, then just rook to b2 as in the game. Rook to f3, now rook to b2. And Magnus is coming in, he's doubling on the 7th, aiming at f2, and there's not a whole lot that Hans Niemann can do about it. King g2, rook a to a2. Now we'll go back to our question. Remember, Nimzo told us that it doesn't matter how well placed a knight is, it's how close is it to the theater of action. Well, this knight is out of play. It looks great. Hang it up in a museum. Put it on your wall. Looks great. Isn't doing anything. Bishop to h4 defends f2, and now g5. Kicks that bishop. If the bishop were to take the pawn, then just rook f2 check. The pawn at f2 would be under defended. White would be lost. So bishop to g3 is forced, and now rook to a3. And the pawn at b3 is beginning to fall, is going to fall. And with the material advantage Magnus already has, and the fact that white is passively placed and has no counterplay, Hans Niemann resigned in this position. An exciting game, even though it didn't have queens, and a lot to learn from it. I hope you enjoyed it. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.